The morning sun painted golden streaks across the driveway as Mr. Chen adjusted his tie in the mirror of his brand new car. The sleek black luxury sedan had been his dream for 15 years, something he promised himself he'd buy when he finally made it. And he had made it, from a small-town lawyer to becoming one of the most respected circuit court judges in the state. He ran his hand along the smooth leather steering wheel, still unable to believe this beauty was actually his. That new car smell still lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of his morning coffee in the cup holder. The purchase hadn't been impulsive. He'd researched for months, compared models, and waited for the perfect deal. His wife had teased him about spending more time choosing the car than he did deliberating on some court cases. As he backed out of his driveway in the quiet suburban neighborhood, he waved to his elderly neighbor who was already out tending to her roses. The homes here were well kept, with manicured lawns and children's bikes scattered across driveways, a testament to the community he'd worked so hard to become part of. His own 2 kids had left for college, but the neighborhood still felt alive with the sounds of the next generation growing up. The drive to the courthouse was typically his time to mentally prepare for the day ahead. He had 3 important cases on his docket: a property dispute, a domestic violence case, and a civil rights matter that had been making local headlines. Each would require his full attention and careful consideration. The weight of making decisions that affected people's lives never got lighter, even after all these years on the bench. Traffic was light this morning, and he enjoyed the smooth handling of his new car as he navigated the familiar streets. He'd taken a slightly different route today, wanting to avoid the construction on Main Street. The detour took him through some older parts of town, past a high school where his daughter had graduated as valedictorian just last year. The memory brought a proud smile to his face. He was listening to his favorite morning news podcast, something that helped him stay current with world events, when he noticed movement in his rearview mirror. Regular commuters were going about their morning routines. Parents dropping kids at school, people heading to work, delivery trucks making their rounds. It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning in the city he called home for the past 2 decades. The courthouse was only 3 blocks away now, its historic limestone facade already visible in the distance. He was thinking about the coffee shop across the street, wondering if he had time to grab a second cup before his first hearing, when everything changed. The peaceful morning shattered with the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his mirror, accompanied by the short whoop of a police siren. His heart skipped a beat, then started racing. Years of legal experience told him to stay calm, but decades of life experience made his palms sweat. He checked his speed. He hadn't been speeding. His registration was current, insurance up to date. There was no reason for this stop. Yet here he was, pulling over to the curb, watching in his side mirror as a young officer stepped out of his patrol car. Little did he know that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. This morning would test everything he believed about progress, justice, and the power of understanding. As he put the car in park and placed his hands where they would be visible, he took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would require all of his patience, wisdom, and self-control. The clicking of the officer's boots on the pavement grew louder as he approached, and Mr. Chen couldn't help but notice how the other drivers slowed down to stare as they passed by. He straightened his tie again, a habit that had always helped him feel more in control. Today, he wasn't sure it would be enough. The police lights flashed brightly in Mr. Chen's mirrors, casting red and blue shadows across his dashboard. His heart was beating faster now, but his mind stayed clear. He'd been in this situation before, though not since wearing the judge's robes. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the young officer speaking into his radio, his face serious under the brim of his cap. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, with some cars slowing down to get a better look. Mr. Chen noticed how some drivers quickly turned their heads away when he made eye contact, while others stared openly. He felt exposed, sitting there in his expensive car, dressed in his perfectly pressed suit, waiting for what would come next. The officer, who couldn't have been more than 25, approached the car with his hand resting near his holster. His steps were measured, cautious, as if he was approaching something dangerous rather than a middle-aged man in a business suit. Mr. Chen could read the officer's nameplate, Officer K. Williams, and noticed the slight tremor in the young man's hand as he positioned himself slightly behind the driver's side window. "Good morning," the officer said, but his tone didn't match the greeting. His voice was tight, authoritative. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen from the downtown area last night. I'm going to need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." Mr. Chen felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd bought the car just 3 weeks ago from the most prestigious dealership in town. He'd spent nearly 2 hours signing paperwork and chatting with the owner, who'd been more than happy to sell to a local judge. Now, sitting in his own car, he was being treated like a criminal. "Officer," Mr. Chen started, keeping his voice steady and professional, "I want to reach for my documents in the glove compartment. I'm telling you this so you feel comfortable with my movements." He spoke clearly, drawing from years of experience in tense courtroom situations. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Williams commanded, his voice getting sharper. "Are you the owner of this vehicle?" More patrol cars were arriving now, their sirens silent but lights flashing, creating quite a scene on the quiet morning street. Mr. Chen could see people gathering on the sidewalk, some with their phones out, recording. He thought about his own children, about the conversations he'd had with them about situations exactly like this one. The morning sun that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt harsh and exposing. Through his open window, Mr. Chen could smell the coffee from the nearby cafe mixing with the exhaust from idling police cars. A school bus passed by slowly, young faces pressed against the windows, watching the scene unfold. "Yes, I am the owner," Mr. Chen replied calmly. "I purchased this vehicle 3 weeks ago. All the documentation is in order. Would you like to see it?" He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his college ring catching the sunlight, a reminder of how far he'd come, and yet how some things hadn't changed at all. Officer Williams shifted his weight, looking uncertain for a moment. More officers were stepping out of their cars now, creating an unnecessary show of force for a simple traffic stop. Mr. Chen could hear their radios crackling, dispatchers' voices mixing with the ambient sounds of the city waking up. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge. Years of legal experience told Mr. Chen that what happened next would depend largely on how he handled himself in the next few minutes. He thought about his courtroom just 3 blocks away, where he made decisions that affected people's lives every day. Now he was on the other side, feeling the full weight of judgment and presumption pressing down on him through his car window. A senior officer was approaching now, his walk more relaxed, experienced. Mr. Chen hoped this might be the turning point, but he knew from both professional and personal experience that situations like these could go either way. The morning had started so normally, but now time seemed to slow down as he waited for what would happen next. The confrontation was reaching a critical point. The senior officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, stopped halfway to the car, his eyes suddenly widening with recognition. But Officer Williams, still unaware, continued his questioning with the same tense authority. "Sir, I need to see your documentation now," Officer Williams insisted, his voice carrying across the growing crowd of onlookers. The morning breeze carried whispers from the sidewalk, where more people had gathered with their phones raised. Mr. Chen took a slow, deep breath. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my glove compartment now. Inside are my registration and insurance documents. My wallet with my license is in my inner jacket pocket. Which would you like me to retrieve first?" His voice remained steady, though his heart was racing beneath his crisp white shirt. The young officer hesitated, clearly caught between his training and the unusual composure of the man he'd pulled over. "Slowly reach for your glove compartment," he directed, his hand still hovering near his holster. As Mr. Chen carefully moved his hand from the steering wheel, He noticed Lieutenant Rodriguez quickening his pace toward them. The lieutenant's face showed concern, maybe even embarrassment. He knew what was about to happen, the moment of revelation that would change the entire dynamic of this stop. The leather of the glove compartment made a soft sound as it opened. Inside, Mr. Chen's documents were perfectly organized in a leather folder, a habit from his early days as a lawyer. He could feel the morning sun warming his back through the car window, hear the chirping of birds that seemed oddly out of place in this tense moment. "Here are my registration and insurance," Mr. Chen said, holding the documents with both hands clearly visible. "As you'll see, I purchased this vehicle 3 weeks ago from Downtown Luxury Motors. The dealership owner, Mr. Thompson, would be happy to verify this information." Officer Williams took the papers, studying them with intense concentration. His forehead wrinkled as he read the name on the registration, then looked at Mr. Chen again. Something wasn't adding up in the young officer's mind: the expensive car, the professional attire, the calm demeanor. That's when Lieutenant Rodriguez finally reached them. "Officer Williams," he said quietly but firmly, "this is Judge Chen from the Circuit Court." The lieutenant's words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. The change in Officer Williams's face was immediate. His eyes widened, and a flush crept up his neck to his cheeks. The papers in his hands trembled slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. He had just accused one of the most respected judges in the city of car theft. I apologized, Your Honor," Officer Williams stammered, his earlier authority crumbling. "We had a report of a similar vehicle being stolen, and I thought—" Mr. Chen raised his hand gently, cutting off the officer's explanation. "Officer Williams," he said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom, "I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here. Not as a judge and an officer, but as two people trying to understand each other better." The growing crowd on the sidewalk had fallen silent, sensing that they were witnessing something important. The other police officers who had arrived as backup began to look uncomfortable, some returning to their vehicles, others pretending to be busy with their radios. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped closer, positioning himself between the car and the crowd. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "would you prefer to continue this conversation at the station or in your chambers?" Mr. Chen looked at Officer Williams, seeing not just a police officer now, but a young man who had made assumptions based on appearances, assumptions that could have had serious consequences under different circumstances. The morning sun continued to rise over the city, casting long shadows across the street, as he made a decision that would impact not just this moment, but potentially many lives going forward. "I think," Mr. Chen said, looking directly at Officer Williams, "this is exactly where this conversation needs to happen. Right here, right now, where it started." He unfastened his seatbelt, his movements still deliberately slow and clear. Sometimes the best lessons are learned in unexpected places. The tension in the air shifted as Mr. Chen stepped out of his car. The morning had grown warmer, and the small crowd of onlookers had become completely silent, watching the scene unfold. Even the usual morning traffic seemed to have slowed down, as if the whole street was holding its breath. "First," Mr. Chen said, straightening his suit jacket, "let's move those patrol cars. We're creating unnecessary traffic, and I believe we can handle this situation with fewer flashing lights." His calm authority carried across the scene, and within moments, most of the backup units began to disperse, their lights turning off one by one. Officer Williams stood rooted to his spot, still holding Mr. Chen's documents. His face showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment, confusion, and something deeper, like someone questioning everything they thought they knew. Lieutenant Rodriguez had stepped back slightly, giving them space while staying close enough to supervise. "Officer Williams," Mr. Chen began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom, "how many traffic stops have you made this month?" The question seemed to catch the young officer off guard. Probably around 50, Your Honor, he replied, his voice slightly shaky. And how many of those vehicles were you certain were stolen? Mr. Chen continued, leaning slightly against his car. The morning sun cast shadows across his face as he spoke. Officer Williams swallowed hard. We had 3 confirmed stolen vehicle reports this week. All luxury vehicles, all black, similar to. His voice trailed off as he realized what he was saying. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from the nearby cafe. Some of the onlookers had lowered their phones, seeming to sense that they were witnessing something more meaningful than a viral video moment. Let me tell you what I experienced, Mr. Chen said, his voice now softer but still clear. I felt my heart rate increase when I saw your lights. I felt my palms get sweaty, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. I started thinking about my children, my family, my position in the community, all in those few seconds. He paused, letting his words sink in. A paper coffee cup rolled across the sidewalk, the only sound breaking the silence. Officer Williams had finally lowered his hand from his holster, his posture becoming less rigid. I've been a judge for 15 years, Mr. Chen continued. Before that, I was a lawyer for 12. And yet, the moment those lights came on, I wasn't any of those things. I was just another person in a nice car who didn't fit someone's expectation of who should be driving it. Lieutenant Rodriguez shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable but attentive. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained were listening intently, some nodding in understanding. Your job is difficult, Officer Williams, Mr. Chen acknowledged. You make split-second decisions to protect our community, but those decisions can't be based on what you think you know about people at first glance. The cost is too high. A school bell rang in the distance, reminding everyone that the world was still turning, that regular life was continuing just a few blocks away. Mr. Chen checked his watch. His first court session would be starting soon, but this moment felt more important than any case on his docket. I made an assumption. Officer Williams finally spoke, his voice steadier now. I saw a vehicle matching a description, and I made assumptions that went beyond that description. I apologize, Your Honor. An apology is a good start, Mr. Chen replied, but I'm more interested in what happens next. What will you take away from this morning? How will it change the way you approach your next traffic stop? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The morning had started as a simple drive to work, but had transformed into something much more significant. A moment of potential change, of understanding, of growth. The city continued to wake up around them. But here, in this small section of street, time seemed to stand still as they waited for Officer Williams's response. Officer Williams took a deep breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as he gathered his thoughts. The morning traffic continued to move around them, creating a gentle background hum to this important moment. The young officer looked down at his polished boots, then back up at Mr. Chen, his eyes showing a new kind of understanding. I was taught to trust my instincts in the academy, Officer Williams began, his voice steadier now. But maybe sometimes our instincts are shaped by things we don't want to admit to ourselves. He paused, struggling to find the right words. When I saw your car, I didn't see the person behind the wheel. I saw a profile, a statistic, a possibility. Mr. Chen nodded encouragingly, noticing how the remaining onlookers had drawn closer, their phones now forgotten at their sides. Even Lieutenant Rodriguez seemed deeply invested in the conversation, his usual professional distance softening into genuine interest. You know, Mr. Chen said, adjusting his tie thoughtfully, 20 years ago, I was driving a much less expensive car, wearing a much cheaper suit, but I got stopped just like this. The only difference was, back then, I was a young lawyer heading to court to defend my client. He smiled slightly at the memory. The officer who stopped me that day never knew he had pulled over an attorney on his way to court. A delivery truck rumbled past, momentarily drowning out the conversation. When it passed, the silence seemed even more profound. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the shadows had shortened around them. Time was moving forward, but this moment felt suspended, important. "Your Honor," Officer Williams said, straightening his back slightly, "I'd like to learn from this. I mean really learn, not just apologize and go back to doing things the same way." His voice carried a genuine sincerity that hadn't been there before. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on his young officer's shoulder. "Perhaps," he suggested, "this is an opportunity for something bigger than just one traffic stop." Mr. Chen's eyes lit up with an idea. "Officer Williams, what's your schedule like next week?" The question seemed to surprise everyone, including the lieutenant. I work regular patrol, Your Honor," Williams replied, looking confused. "How would you feel about spending a day in my courtroom?" Mr. Chen proposed, his voice warm but serious. "Not as a defendant or witness, but as an observer. I think you might find it enlightening to see how justice looks from the other side of the bench." The remaining spectators murmured quietly, some nodding in approval. A woman in a business suit gave a quiet yes under her breath, while an elderly man wiped at his eyes with a handkerchief. "I'd like that, Your Honor," Officer Williams responded, his face showing both relief and anticipation. "I really would." Lieutenant Rodriguez was already pulling out his phone, presumably to adjust schedules. "We can make this work," he said, his tone supportive. "In fact, maybe we should consider making this a regular part of our officers' training." The morning had transformed completely from its tense beginning. The harsh glare of police lights had been replaced by the warm sunlight of understanding. Even the air felt different, charged with possibility rather than tension. Mr. Chen checked his watch again. His first case would be starting soon. But what had happened here, on this street corner, felt like its own kind of justice being served. Not the kind that comes with a gavel and rows, but the kind that comes from human hearts opening to new understanding. "Well," Mr. Chen said, reaching for his car door, "I have a full docket waiting for me. Officer Williams, I'll expect you in my courtroom next Tuesday. Lieutenant, my clerk will contact you with the details." He paused, looking at both officers. Sometimes the most important cases don't happen in the courtroom at all. The morning sun caught the polish of his car as he prepared to leave, but the vehicle no longer seemed like just a luxury sedan. It had become something else, a catalyst for change, a bridge between two worlds that too often failed to understand each other. The following Tuesday arrived bright and clear. Officer Williams stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, looking up at the imposing building. He had traded his police uniform for a simple dark suit, but his military straight posture gave away his profession. His hands smoothed down his tie for the 10th time. A nervous habit he picked up from his father. Inside the courthouse, the usual morning bustle was in full swing. Lawyers hurried past with briefcases and coffee cups, court clerks shuffled papers, and families waited anxiously on wooden benches. The young officer felt out of place without his badge and uniform, just another face in the crowd. "Officer Williams," a warm voice called out. He turned to see Mr. Chen approaching, wearing his black judicial robes. "I'm glad you made it. Follow me. We have an interesting day ahead." The judge's smile was genuine, making Williams relax slightly for the first time that morning. They walked through the courthouse corridors, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. "Today," Mr. Chen explained, "we have 12 cases on the docket. Each one is different, but they all have something in common. They're about people whose lives intersect with the law in ways they never expected." The courtroom was already filling up when they entered through the judge's private door. Mr. Chen directed Williams to a special seat next to the clerk's station, where he would have a clear view of both the judge's bench and those appearing before the court. "Watch their faces," Mr. Chen said quietly. "Not just the defendants, but everyone. The lawyers, the witnesses, the family members. Every person who walks through those doors carries their own story, their own fears, their own hopes. The first case was called A Young Man in a Neat but Worn Suit Charged with Shoplifting Baby Formula. As the story unfolded, Williams learned about the man's lost job, his sick infant, his desperation. It wasn't a simple case of right and wrong anymore. It was a human story of struggle and choice. Case after case followed, each one peeling back layers of complexity that Williams had never considered during his traffic stops. A woman fighting an eviction notice while caring for her elderly mother. A teenager caught with a small amount of drugs, his football coach speaking up as a character witness. During a brief recess, Mr. Chen turned to Williams. "What are you thinking so far?" he asked, pouring them both a cup of water from the pitcher on his desk. Williams took a sip, gathering his thoughts. "I'm thinking about how quick we are to judge on the street," he said slowly. "We see a moment, a snapshot, but here we get the whole picture. The before and after. The why." Mr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I wanted you to see. Every person who steps into this courtroom is more than their worst moment. Just like every person you stop on the street is more than what you see through your patrol car window." The afternoon session brought more stories, more faces, more moments of understanding. Williams watched as Mr. Chen listened to each case with equal attention, asking questions that went beyond the surface, seeking to understand the human element behind each legal issue. A mother testified about her son's struggles with mental health, her voice breaking as she described trying to get him help before his arrest. Williams thought about similar calls he'd responded to, wondering how many times he'd missed the bigger picture. As the day wound down, the courtroom slowly emptied. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as Williams and Mr. Chen sat in the now quiet space. The young officer's notebook was full of observations, but his mind was even fuller with new perspectives. "The law is black and white on paper," Mr. Chen said, removing his judicial robes. "But the people affected by it live in full color. That's something I never forget, whether I'm wearing these robes or sitting in my car being questioned by a young officer doing his job." Williams felt the weight of that statement. The memory of their first encounter just a week ago seemed both recent and distant, like looking at a photograph of yourself from years ago. Familiar, but somehow changed by time and understanding. The changes in Officer Williams became noticeable to his fellow officers almost immediately. During the next morning's briefing, he sat quietly at the back of the room, listening to the daily reports with new ears. When they discussed a series of calls from a troubled neighborhood, he raised his hand. "Maybe we could talk to the community center director there," he suggested, surprising his colleagues. "Get to know the residents before we have to respond to calls." The room fell silent for a moment, then the sergeant nodded approvingly. Out on patrol, his approach had shifted. When he pulled over a beaten-up old car with a broken taillight, instead of immediately reaching for his ticket book, he listened. The driver was a tired-looking man heading home from his second job, saving money to fix the light, but choosing to buy his kids' school supplies first. "Get that light fixed when you can," Williams said, handing back the license. "And drive safely." The look of relief on the man's face stayed with him for the rest of his shift. Word of his day in court had spread through the department. Some officers were skeptical, others curious. During lunch breaks, Williams found himself sharing what he'd learned, not preaching but telling stories. Stories about the people he'd seen in court, stories that made his fellow officers lean in and listen. "It's not about being soft on crime," he explained to his partner one evening as they cruised their beat. "It's about seeing the whole picture. Remember that domestic disturbance call we had last week? Made me think about a case I saw in court. There's always more to the story than what we see in those first few minutes." Lieutenant Rodriguez noticed the change too. He saw how Williams took extra time with each interaction, how he'd started keeping a small notebook of community resources, food banks, job training programs, youth centers. The lieutenant began bringing Williams along to community meetings, where his thoughtful questions and genuine interest in residents' concerns helped bridge old gaps. One rainy afternoon, Williams spotted a familiar luxury car at a stoplight. Mr. Chen was behind the wheel, and their eyes met briefly. The judge gave a small nod of recognition, and Williams returned it with a smile. Neither man needed to pull over this time. The lesson had already been learned. The real breakthrough came during a tense situation downtown. A group of teenagers had gathered outside a store, and the owner had called the police, assuming they were up to no good. Williams arrived first, but instead of immediately ordering them to move along, he approached with a question. "You guys know there's a basketball court 2 blocks over?" he asked, noticing the ball one teen was holding. "I used to play there when I was in high school." The tension dissolved as quickly as it had built. Within minutes, he learned they were waiting for a friend who worked at the store. The owner, watching from inside, slowly relaxed and went back to work. Back at the station, Williams started organizing informal meetings between officers and community members. They weren't official events, just coffee and conversation, a chance for both sides to see each other as people first, uniforms, and stereotypes second. "You know what the judge taught me?" he told a rookie officer who asked about his new approach. "That every time we interact with someone, we're not just enforcing the law, we're writing a story together. And we get to choose what kind of story it's going to be." His arrest numbers had gone down, but his conflict resolution successes had gone up. The sergeant noted that complaints in Williams' patrol area had dropped significantly. More importantly, people in the neighborhood had started to wave when his car passed by, not out of fear or obligation, but genuine recognition. One evening, as his shift was ending, a call came in about some teens causing trouble. When he arrived, he recognized one of the boys from his community meetings. The situation resolved quickly, not because of his badge, but because of the trust he'd built. As he watched the kids walk home, he thought about that morning traffic stop that had changed everything. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department's training room was packed. Officers from every shift had squeezed in, some standing against the walls, others sitting on desk edges. At the front of the room, Officer Williams stood beside Mr. Chen, both men ready to share their story. "I never thought a simple traffic stop would lead to this," Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "But sometimes the biggest changes start with our biggest mistakes." The room was silent, every eye focused on him. Mr. Chen watched from the side, noting how different Williams looked now, not just in appearance, but in how he carried himself. Gone was the nervous, defensive young officer. In his place stood a man who had learned to balance authority with understanding. "Last month," Williams continued, "I stopped a car for running a red light. The driver was a young woman, clearly upset. Instead of immediately writing a ticket, I asked if everything was okay." He paused, letting the moment sink in. Turned out she was rushing to the hospital where her father had just been admitted. I ended up giving her an escort there. Several officers nodded, remembering similar situations from their own patrols. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams as Williams shared more stories from his transformed approach to policing. Mr. Chen stepped forward then, his casual suit a change from his usual judicial robes. "Officer Williams didn't just learn from our encounter," he told the room. "He's helped create something new, something important." He gestured to a stack of papers on the desk, a new training program they developed together. The program was simple but powerful. Every new officer would spend a day in court, not as security or a witness, but as an observer. They would see the full stories behind the quick encounters, understand the impact of their street-level decisions. "But it goes both ways," Mr. Chen explained. "I've learned too. I've started inviting law students to ride along with patrol officers to see the split-second decisions they face." A few veteran officers nodded approvingly at this. During the break, officers clustered in small groups, sharing their own stories. A senior officer spoke about a homeless man he'd arrested multiple times before finally helping him connect with a veterans program. Another mentioned how she'd started keeping granola bars in her patrol car for hungry kids she met on her beat. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Williams demonstrated his new approach to traffic stops, standing where drivers could see him clearly, explaining his actions before making them, looking for opportunities to help rather than just enforce. Remember last week? His partner called out from the back. That stop with the teenagers? Williams smiled, knowing where this was going. 3 kids in a car, music too loud, Williams explained to the room. Old me would have gone straight to writing tickets. Instead, we talked. Found out they were heading to a job interview but got lost. Ended up giving them directions and some interview tips. Chuckles rippled through the room. Mr. Chen watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The change was happening, one story at a time, one officer at a time. It wasn't always easy. Some resisted, clinging to old ways, but the momentum was building. As the session wound down, an older officer raised his hand. I've been on the force 20 years, he said, his voice gruff but thoughtful. Maybe it's time we all learn some new tricks. The room hummed with agreement. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm. Traffic flowing, people hurrying past, lives intersecting in countless ways. But inside this room, something fundamental was shifting. It wasn't just about changing procedures or policies. It was about changing hearts and minds, one interaction at a time. Williams gathered his materials, catching Mr. Chen's eye. They shared a knowing look, both understanding that their unexpected encounter had grown into something much bigger than themselves, something that could ripple out and touch countless lives in their community. 1 year later, on a bright spring morning, much like the day of that first traffic stop, Mr. Chen stood at his courtroom window, watching the city wake up. The view had changed somehow, not the buildings or streets, but the way he saw them, the stories he now knew lived behind every window and door. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Williams. Big day today. Nervous but ready. Mr. Chen smiled, tucking the phone back into his robe. Downstairs, 20 new police recruits were filing into the courthouse for their first day of the new Community Bridge program. The program had grown beyond anything they'd imagined that morning a year ago. What started as one officer spending a day in court had blossomed into something that was changing the whole city, one small interaction at a time. In the main hall, Officer Williams was greeting the recruits. He'd been promoted to training officer recently, his new approach to community policing catching the attention of departments across the state. Welcome to the other side of the badge, he told the fresh-faced group. Today, you're going to see what happens after the arrests, after the traffic stops, after the moments that might seem simple to us, but change lives forever. Upstairs, Mr. Chen's courtroom was different too. A row of seats was now permanently reserved for officers in training. But more importantly, the atmosphere had changed. Officers who brought in cases came prepared not just with evidence, but with context, the full stories of the people they'd encountered. The morning's first case involved a teenage boy caught shoplifting. The arresting officer, one of Williams' trainees, stood up to speak. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to share some relevant information. The defendant is his family's primary caregiver. He's been working 2 jobs while finishing high school. The store owner is willing to work with him on a resolution. Mr. Chen noticed how different this was from a year ago. The officer seeing beyond the crime to the person, the situation, the possibility for real change. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, hearing his story told with understanding rather than judgment. During lunch, Mr. Chen met Williams in the courthouse cafe. They watched as officers and community members shared tables, the old invisible barriers slowly dissolving. A public defender joked with a police sergeant. A bailiff helped a nervous witness find her courtroom. Remember when you pulled me over? Mr. Chen asked, stirring his coffee. Could you have imagined this? He gestured to the scene around them. Williams shook his head, smiling. Never. But that's the thing about change. It starts with one moment, one decision to do things differently. The afternoon brought more evidence of their impact. A community meeting in the courthouse's main conference room drew a mixed crowd. Officers, residents, business owners, students. They weren't there to complain or defend, but to plan together, to build bridges. One elderly resident stood up to share how an officer had helped her grandson find a job instead of arresting him for trespassing. A shop owner described how regular conversations with beat officers had helped him understand his young customers better. As the day wound down, Mr. Chen received a letter from the State Police Academy. They wanted to implement the program statewide. Other cities had been calling too, interested in this new approach that was reducing tensions and building trust. Walking to his car that evening, Mr. Chen passed Officer Williams in the parking lot. They didn't need to stop and talk, just a nod, a smile, a shared understanding of how far they'd come. The same luxury car that had once been the source of suspicion now symbolized something else: the power of seeing beyond first impressions. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows between the buildings, both men drove home knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to bridge the gaps between people. But now they had something they didn't have before: a way forward, a path built on understanding, one traffic stop at a time.